What do you do with a love that left without saying goodbye? Not the kind of love that fades. Not the slow unraveling of two people who simply grow apart. We are not talking about a relationship that died. We are talking about one that was severed. Cleanly. Without warning. At the exact moment it was most alive. Celestine Burke knows the answer. You build. You rise. You become so formidable that the memory of what broke you starts to feel like fuel rather than damage. You turn 32 years old as the youngest managing director at a private equity firm with offices in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. You buy an apartment in a building where the hallways smell like expensive candles and the elevator moves without a sound. You collect your mornings like they belong entirely to you, because they do. She had done all of that. Every single piece of it, and it had worked. Until the morning she walked out of her new apartment on the 14th floor of Vela Residences in Los Angeles and discovered, standing at the door directly across the hall, the one person she had spent 4 years erasing, Junwoo Nam, Korean, billionaire, her neighbor, the man who once kissed her like she was the only language he had ever learned, and then disappeared without leaving a single word. This is not a story about forgiveness coming easily. It is not a story about a woman who melts the moment her ex-lover reappears and explains himself. Celestine Burke does not melt. She never did. This is a story about two people who are stubborn enough to keep hurting each other and honest enough, eventually, to admit why. It is a story about the kind of love that does not ask permission to return. About the moment a man who spent years hiding from his own pain finally looks at what his silence cost the one person who deserved his truth. It is a story about the night he came back, and what it took for her to believe he had actually stayed. If this story already has its hands around your heart, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment and tell us, would you let him back in? The building was called Vela Residences, and it sat in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles, like a quiet argument about what the city could be when it tried. 14 floors of glass and concrete, and carefully designed silence. A doorman named Marcus, who remembered every resident's preferred coffee order. A rooftop terrace where no one ever seemed to actually go. The kind of place that cost enough to feel safe and was elegant enough to never feel sterile. Celestine had moved in on a Tuesday in early March of 2024. She was 32 years old. She had flown in from New York the Friday before, overseen the delivery of her furniture on Saturday, spent Sunday arranging the kitchen the way she liked it, obsessively, precisely, with a playlist that no one else would ever hear. By Tuesday morning, she was already on calls with Seoul and Singapore before 6 a.m. Standing at her kitchen counter in a silk robe with a mug of black coffee, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who had not arrived at her position by accident. She had chosen Los Angeles because the firm needed a West Coast presence, and because New York had started to feel like a city that knew too much about her. LA offered the promise of anonymity and perpetual sunlight. The possibility of reinvention, or at minimum, the possibility of not being recognized on every corner by someone who knew a version of her she was done performing. She had not chosen Los Angeles because of anyone else. She had made certain of that. The first time she saw him, it was a Wednesday morning, 6 days after she moved in. She was leaving for the office at 7:15, dressed in a charcoal blazer and high-waisted black trousers, her portfolio bag over one shoulder, her phone already in her hand. She stepped out of apartment 1402 and turned toward the elevator. The door of apartment 1401 opened at the same moment. She did not scream. She was not that kind of woman. But the coffee she was holding, her second cup, the one she always brought for the car, went sideways, and she caught it only because her reflexes were excellent and her grip had always been stronger than people expected. He froze. She froze. The hallway held them both for a moment that felt completely outside of time. Junwoo Nam was 35 years old, and 4 years had not diminished him in any direction. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they had prepared themselves to face, and still, in the actual moment, find themselves entirely unprepared for. His expression moved through several things quickly: surprise, then something that might have been relief, then something much more complicated that she did not want to name. Celestine's face did none of those things. It settled into a composure so complete it was almost architectural. He said her name. She looked at him the way you look at a piece of furniture you did not order, acknowledged its presence, declined to be moved by it. Then she walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with her back straight, and her eyes on the doors until they opened, and she stepped inside. She did not look back. In the car, heading west on Sunset, she sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then she called her assistant and rescheduled her 8 a.m. to a 9 a.m., citing a delay she did not explain. Then she sat still for 2 more minutes. Then she said, very quietly, to no one at all, absolutely not. And she meant it. She did not know, because she could not have known, that Junwoo had been living in apartment 1401 for 11 days before she arrived. She did not know that he had learned she was moving in 3 days before her furniture arrived, when Marcus at the front desk, a man with the conversational instincts of someone who genuinely believed all neighbors should be friends, had mentioned, in the cheerful way of someone sharing completely benign news, that the apartment across the hall had been leased to a woman relocating from New York. Private equity, he had said, very accomplished, moving in Tuesday. She did not know that Junwoo had stood in his apartment that evening with his phone in his hand, that he had considered leaving, and that he had ultimately stayed, not because he was careless about what it would mean, but because something in him, the part that had been living alongside the consequences of his own decisions for 4 years, had decided that running again was no longer something he was capable of choosing. He had told himself it might not even be her. Burke was not an uncommon name. He had known, somehow, that it was. And so when the doors of apartment 1402 opened on that Wednesday morning, and Celestine walked out looking like every version of herself he had ever admired, composed, precise, moving through the world with the particular grace of a woman who had decided long ago exactly who she was, he had not been entirely surprised. He had been devastated in the quiet way of a man who expected the wound and got it anyway. She had looked through him like he was architectural detail, a decorative feature of the hallway, present but not worth acknowledging beyond the minimum. It was, he understood, exactly what he deserved. That did not make it easier to breathe. They were both extremely good at not speaking to each other. For 3 weeks, they operated on a system of elaborate, unspoken precision. Celestine learned his patterns. She was a woman who analyzed data for a living, and human behavior was simply data with feelings attached, and she adjusted accordingly. He left early, usually before 7. She began leaving at 6:45. He returned between 8 and 9 in the evening. She began scheduling dinners and late meetings that conveniently kept her out until 9:30 at the earliest. The elevator became a negotiation, not an explicit one, but both of them seemed to develop an instinct for when the other had recently used it, and both of them seemed to find reasons to take the stairs when necessary, which in a building of 14 floors said something substantial about the depth of the avoidance. Her colleagues noticed she was sharper than usual, more focused, a little faster to end conversations that weren't generating returns. Her mentor at the firm, a Jamaican-British woman named Ingrid, who had known Celestine since her first year out of Wharton, called her in late March and said, without preamble, "Something happened. Tell me what." Celestine told her. All of it, not the old story, just the new development, the hallway, the frozen moment, the elevator. Ingrid was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to be able to work this?" Celestine said she already was. Ingrid said that was not what she had asked. The conversation ended without resolution, which was unusual for both of them, and Celestine poured herself a glass of wine that evening and stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the lights of the city below and allowed herself, for approximately 11 minutes, to feel what she had been not feeling since that Wednesday morning. It was not love. She was careful about that. What she felt was older and more complicated than love. It was the memory of love sitting inside her ribcage like an uninvited guest that had been there so long it knew where the good glasses were kept. It was anger that had been well managed for 4 years and had now, with proximity as its provocation, begun to hum at a frequency she had to actively suppress. It was the particular fury of a woman who had done everything right, who had processed and healed and rebuilt and risen, discovering that the work of recovery does not make the person who hurt you smaller. It just makes you better at pretending. She finished the wine. She went to bed. She woke up at 5:15 and went for a run and was on calls by 6. She was excellent at this. She had always been excellent at this. Junwoo's company, a venture technology firm called Namso Capital, had recently expanded its Pacific operations. He had built it from a single Seoul-based fund into a multi-continental enterprise over 8 years. And at 35, he was the kind of billionaire who was written about in business publications for his instincts rather than his inheritance. His family had money, old Korean manufacturing money, significant and serious, but Namseo was entirely his. Every dollar of its valuation had passed through his judgment. Los Angeles was the next phase. He had chosen it for the same reason serious people always chose it for business. The intersection of technology, entertainment, and Pacific capital made it impossible to ignore if you were building for the next decade. He had also chosen it because his therapist in Seoul, a small, relentlessly patient man named Dr. Yoon, whom Junwoo had been seeing for 3 years, had said something during their final session before the move that had lodged itself in his chest like a splinter. He had said, "You have spent 3 years understanding what broke you. You cannot spend 3 more just being someone who is fixed. At some point you have to go back into the world and find out if the understanding actually changed anything." Junwoo had not planned on the world depositing Celestine Burke across the hall. He had not planned on a great many things that had nonetheless turned out to be the most important ones. He watched her, when he could, the way you watch something you are afraid to want too directly, from the edges, through the small gaps that proximity made unavoidable. He knew the sound of her door. He knew the precise, unhurried rhythm of her heels on the hallway floor when she was not in a hurry, unhurried even when she was, which was always, because she moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with pace. He knew she worked earlier than anyone else in the building and later than most. He knew she had not once, in 3 weeks, looked at him with anything approaching the warmth he remembered. He had not expected her to. He simply felt the absence of it the way you feel the absence of light in a room where there used to be a window. It was the 3rd Friday of April when the avoidance system broke. Celestine had been out later than she planned. Not for work, a fact that was, in itself, unusual enough to note. Her colleague and tentative friend in the LA office, a man named Damien Okafor, had invited her to the opening of a restaurant in West Hollywood. Damien was 38, Nigerian-British, effortlessly charming, and had been making his interest in Celestine known in the particular manner of someone who believes that elegance and persistence are not mutually exclusive. She had gone because she had been saying no to social things for 3 weeks, and Ingrid had called to tell her that isolation was not a coping strategy, it was a symptom. She had gone because Damien was good company, and the restaurant was genuinely excellent, and she had spent 3 hours eating well and laughing genuinely, and almost, not thinking about the hallway on the 14th floor. It was 11:47 when she came through the front door of Vela Residences. Marcus had already been replaced by the night security, a young man named Tom who nodded with the practiced neutrality of his profession. She took the elevator up, her heels in her hand because 14 floors and 4-inch stilettos was a choice for the ground floor and not for the rest of the evening. And she stepped out onto the 14th floor at 11:52 p.m. Junwoo was standing in the hallway, not waiting for her. She understood that immediately, even through the startled beat of her pulse. He was standing outside his own door with his keys in his hand, clearly having just arrived himself, still in a suit, his jacket gone and his collar open in the way of a man who had spent a long evening negotiating with the world. He had not heard the elevator. He turned when she stepped off it. The hallway was quiet in the way that only very late nights make possible. The building breathed around them. And then he spoke. Not carefully. Not with the measured restraint he had been deploying for 3 weeks. He spoke the way people speak when their composure has been worn down to a final layer and something gets underneath it. He looked at her, and at the restaurant dress and the heels in her hand and the particular looseness that good food and genuine laughter leave on a person's face, and he said, "Arriving home at this hour." The question detonated in the space between them. Celestine went very still. Not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a woman taking precise aim. She looked at him for a long moment. She let the silence sit. And then she said, with the particular calm of someone delivering a verdict, rather than starting a conversation, "I'm sorry." He heard himself. She watched him hear himself. The awareness of what he had just said, the possessive heat of it, the way it had revealed, without any permission from his brain, exactly how much attention he had been paying to her comings and goings, crossed his face in real time. But he did not take it back. That was the thing about Junwoo Nam. He had many flaws, and he had spent 3 years in therapy cataloging most of them. But he was not a man who hid from his own exposures once they were made. He held her gaze. She walked toward her door. Not away from him. Toward her door, which required passing him, which required a proximity that the hallway's width made unavoidable. She stopped when she was level with him, not facing him. Side by side, both of them looking at her door. When she spoke, her voice was precise and low, and carried an edge that had been honed for 4 years. She told him that she did not know what version of reality he was operating in, but in hers, he did not get to ask where she had been. He lost that particular right on a Tuesday evening in November of 2020, when she had called him 6 times, and he had not picked up once. And then she had called him 6 more times the next morning, and the number had gone to voicemail. And by Wednesday afternoon, she had understood, in the way your body understands something before your mind is ready, that he was simply gone. No explanation, no letter, no anything that would have allowed her to make sense of the silence. Just gone. She put her key in the lock. She told him she had built a very good life in the years since then. She told him that whatever he thought he was feeling standing in this hallway at midnight was his business and not hers. She told him, very clearly, and without raising her voice even once, that she was not available to be the audience for his jealousy, or his guilt, or whatever combination of the two that question had come from. She opened her door. She told him, "Good night, Junwoo." She closed it behind her. He stood in the hallway for a long time after that. Long enough for the building's automated lights to dim. Long enough to have the full and unobstructed experience of a man confronting the damage he had done and finding it larger than even his worst accounting of it. When he finally went inside, he did not sleep. Damien Okafor was not a complication in the dramatic sense. He was not scheming or predatory or performing interest he did not feel. He was simply a man who had met Celestine Burke, found her extraordinary, and decided he was interested in her in the way that genuine people are interested in genuine people, openly, without agenda, with patience. He brought her coffee from the place she had mentioned once, 3 weeks into knowing her, in the kind of offhand way that means nothing to the speaker and means everything to the person who was listening. He remembered details. He asked good questions. He was funny in the dry, precise way that Celestine appreciated because it meant he was paying attention. He was in short, exactly the kind of man that would have been uncomplicated if there had not been a Korean billionaire across the hall, silently losing his composure every time Damien's name appeared in her schedule. Junwoo learned his name, not through any active investigation, but because the 14th floor of Vela residences had thin enough walls, and voices in a quiet hallway carry, approximately 10 days after the late-night confrontation. He heard Celestine say it. Heard the particular way she said it, not warm precisely, but easy. The way you say the name of someone you have decided is worth your time. Something happened to him in that moment that he did not have a clean word for. It was not the territorial anger of a man who believes he owns something. He had no rights here. He understood that with absolute clarity. What he felt was something more specific and more painful. The recognition that the life she had built in his absence was real and populated, and did not have a space shaped like him in it. That she had not been waiting. Of course, she had not been waiting. He had not expected her to wait. He had simply, in the deepest and least rational part of himself, not yet integrated the reality of her moving forward as fully as she had moved forward. He called Dr. Yoon in Seoul at an unreasonable hour. Dr. Yoon, to his credit, picked up. Jun-woo explained the situation. All of it. The hallway. The late night. The speech she had given him that had been so accurate it had felt like surgery. And now, Damien. Dr. Yoon listened. And then he asked the only question that mattered. What do you want, Jun-woo? Not what do you think you deserve. Not what you think is fair or reasonable given the history. What do you actually want? The answer came without effort. He wanted her, not possession, not dominion. He wanted to be someone she trusted again. He wanted to deserve the ease with which she had once said his name. He wanted to look across a room and have her look back without the composed distance she had been wearing like armor since March. Dr. Yoon said, "Then you have to tell her the truth, all of it. The thing you have never said out loud to anyone except me. You cannot ask her to consider forgiving you for something she still does not understand." Jun-woo was quiet for a long time. Then he said he did not know if she would want to hear it. Dr. Yoon said, "That is her decision to make, not yours to preempt." He knocked on her door on a Sunday morning in early May, not impulsively. He had thought about it for 9 days. He had written out, in a notebook, what he needed to say, not a script, but a map of the truth, so that when his instinct to protect himself kicked in mid-sentence, as it always did, he would have something to return to. She opened the door and looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for exactly this possibility, and was not particularly pleased that the possibility had materialized. He asked if she had a few minutes. He said he needed to explain something. He said he understood if she said no. She said 3 minutes, and she did not move from the doorway. He told her that in October of 2020, a month before he disappeared, he had received a diagnosis. Not the kind you share casually. A neurological condition. Manageable, he said. Not terminal, but at the time of diagnosis uncertain. And the uncertainty had been the thing that undid him. He had sat in a doctor's office in Seoul and heard words about his nervous system and his future that had rearranged everything he thought he knew about the shape of his own life. He had been 28 years old. They had been together for 7 months. She was 25 and brilliant, and the most alive person he had ever been near, and he had sat in that doctor's office and decided, not slowly but instantly, with the terrible efficiency of a mind operating on fear, that he could not ask her to stay for something he could not yet define. That the most honest thing he could do was remove himself before she made choices based on information that might turn out to be temporary. That disappearing was, in his damaged and frightened logic, a form of protection. He said, "I know how that sounds. I know what it cost you. I am not telling you this to be forgiven. I am telling you because you deserve to know why. And I was a coward who gave you silence instead of truth. And that is the thing I am most ashamed of, not the fear." The silence. She was looking at him when he finished. The composed distance was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, not broken, but stressed, the way a structure sounds different when load is applied to it. She asked, very quietly, "Are you all right now?" He said, "Yes." It took 2 years of treatment and it took longer to stop being afraid. But yes. She nodded once. Then she said, "I appreciate you telling me." And she closed the door. He walked back to his apartment and sat in the silence of it, and did not try to assess whether that had gone well or not. He had done the thing Dr. Yoon said. The rest was not in his hands. The thing about receiving information that reorganizes the past is that you cannot unknow it. You can choose what to do with it. You can decide it is insufficient, or too late, or that the version of the story you had been living with for 4 years served you better than the revised one. But you cannot put it back in the box and return to the clarity of not knowing. Celestine spent 4 days not thinking about it, which was indistinguishable from thinking about it constantly. She thought about October 2020 and tried to place what she remembered of him in that period. She had a good memory, detailed, temporal, precise, the kind of memory that served her well in boardrooms and negotiations. She remembered that he had seemed distracted in a way she had filed, at the time, under busy. He had been building Namseo through a difficult funding cycle. She had been finishing her MBA. Their relationship had been young enough that distance still felt like the normal friction of two ambitious people making schedules work. She had not seen the fear because he had not let her see it. She had not been given the chance. That was the thing she kept returning to, not the diagnosis, which she had processed with the quiet compassion of someone who understands that a 28-year-old man sitting alone in a doctor's office in Seoul could be dismantled by something like that. But the silence, the 6 calls and 6 more calls in the voicemail box, the complete erasure of himself from her life, executed with such precision that she had not even had a wrong answer to cling to, just absence. He had made a decision about what she could handle without asking her. He had chosen her future for her, had decided she would be better off without the complication of his fear, and he had done it without her consent. From behind a wall of shame he had never once tried to let her help him with. She was sitting with all of this on Wednesday evening when she called Ingrid. She told her everything. Ingrid, to her eternal credit, listened without interrupting, which was not her natural mode. When Celestine finished, Ingrid said, "What does Celestine think?" Not what does Celestine feel. What does she think? Ingrid knew her well. Celestine said she thought he was telling the truth. She thought the fear had been real, and the logic, however flawed, however unacceptable, had been genuine. She thought a 28-year-old man who had never been taught that vulnerability was survivable might actually have believed he was sparing her something. She also thought that none of that made the 4 years smaller, that understanding why someone hurt you does not make the hurt retroactively proportionate, that forgiveness, if it came at all, would have to be built out of something more than explanation. Ingrid said, "And Damien?" Celestine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Damien is a good man. He would be good for me in a lot of ways, but I would be doing him a disservice if I let him think he has my full attention right now." Ingrid said, "Well, that's honest." Celestine said, "I've been trying." She told Damien the following Thursday. Not about Junwoo specifically. She was not prepared to explain that particular geography yet. But she told him that her situation was more complicated than she had represented, and that she did not want to be unfair to him by continuing to let him think she was available in the way he deserved someone to be available. Damien listened. He had good listening instincts. And then he said, "I appreciate you telling me." He said it without resentment and without performance, and she thought, this is exactly the kind of man I would have chosen if my heart had kept better records. He said, "If the situation changes, you know where I am." She said she did, and she meant it as kindness. And she suspected he received it as such. She walked back to Vela Residences in the early evening light, the city doing what Los Angeles does in May, pouring gold over everything, indiscriminate and generous. And she thought about what it meant to choose something complicated over something clean. She thought about her 32 years, and the empire she had built, and the 4 years she had spent becoming someone formidable. And she wondered if formidable had ever actually meant what she had been using it to mean. If what she had been protecting, all this time, was strength, or just the appearance of it. She thought about a man who had sat in a doctor's office at 28, alone, and made the worst decision of both their lives out of a fear he had never learned to share. She did not forgive him on that walk home. She did not forgive him that evening, or the next morning, or for several days after that. Forgiveness was not the kind of thing she produced on a timeline, but something shifted in the architecture of her anger. Not dissolved, not dismantled, but rearranged into a shape that left a little more room for the question of what came next. On the second Friday of May, a transformer failure took out the power on the 12th through 16th floors of Vela residences at approximately 9:15 p.m. It was not a dramatic event, as events go. No fire, no injury, no structural concern. Simply darkness. And then the building's backup systems, which covered the lobby and exits and emergency lighting, but not the individual apartments on the affected floors. The elevators locked. Management sent a text at 9:22 informing residents that maintenance was working on it and full power was expected to be restored within 2 to 4 hours. Celestine had been home since 7. She was working through due diligence documents on a potential acquisition, a logistics tech company out of Austin that the firm had been watching for 6 months. And she had candles because she always had candles, and a laptop battery that would last for hours, and she had settled in quite efficiently to wait out the outage. At 9:38, there was a knock at her door. Junwoo stood in the hallway in the faint glow of the emergency lighting with a bottle of wine that he held with the self-awareness of a man who knew this was either a good idea or a terrible one, and had not yet established which. He said, "My building, my fuse box, still my fault somehow." He said it in the wry, self-deprecating way he had always handled his own pretensions, a quality she had once found, and apparently still found, entirely disarming. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the door wider. She told herself it was a power outage, and there was no reason to stand on ceremony about a glass of wine in a building without electricity. She told herself this decision was practical and not significant. She was on some level aware that she was not entirely convincing herself. She found a second candle. He opened the wine, a burgundy he had apparently been holding on to for an occasion he had not previously defined. They sat at her dining table with the city throwing its light through the windows from below, which in the dark of the apartment made the whole room feel like something between a stage set and a dream. They did not discuss the diagnosis, or the hallway confrontation, or Damien, or the 4 years. Not directly. They talked the way people talk when there is an enormous subject in the room that both of them know is there, and both of them have collectively decided to approach by walking around its edges first. He asked about the Austin acquisition. She asked about Namseo's Pacific expansion. He told her about a meeting in Tokyo that had gone sideways in a way that was only funny in retrospect. She told him about a founder who had tried to renegotiate terms at the table and how she had responded to it, which made him laugh, not politely but genuinely, with the full and unguarded openness of someone who had forgotten to be careful. And the sound of it landed in her chest, in a place she had thought she had renovated past. An hour passed, then another. At some point, without announcement, the conversation moved inward. Not rushed, not forced. The way conversations do when two people have been circling a thing long enough that the circling itself becomes exhausting. She asked him what it had been like, not the diagnosis. She understood the medical facts well enough. The period after. The years of managing it alone, of building Namseo while navigating the uncertainty of his own health, of whatever it was that had eventually led to Dr. Yoon and the therapy, and the decision to stop running. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, just locating himself in the question, finding the honest answer rather than the easy one. He said, isolating. He said that the version of strength he had been performing, self-sufficient, untroubled, the kind of man who did not need assistance, had cost him more than he had known how to calculate. He said that Namseo doing well financially had made it easier to pretend he was doing well in every other sense, because success is very good at filling in the gaps where actual well-being is supposed to be. He said, I thought about you. More than I will now tell you for the first time in the dark during a power outage. But I thought about you. She looked at him. The candle between them caught the stillness of the room. She said, "You should have told me. I know why you didn't. I understand the fear of it. But you should have told me, and I should have been the one to decide what I could hold. You took that from me." He said, "Yes, I know. I have known that for 4 years. She said, "I'm not ready to tell you it's okay." He said, "I'm not asking you to." She said, "But I wanted you to know that I'm not. I'm not where I was a month ago, when you knocked on my door and I said goodnight and closed it. I'm not in that same place." He looked at her the way he had looked at her in a hallway 4 years ago, in the last minutes before he had talked himself out of everything good, with something so undefended it was almost hard to witness. The power came back at 11:51, the apartment filled with light all at once, the sudden normality of it jolting both of them back into the present, with a small, shared laugh that was partly relief and partly something else. She walked him to the door. He paused in the doorway and looked at her. He did not kiss her. He did not make a declaration. He said, "Thank you for the evening." He said it the way people say things when they mean considerably more than the words carry and they are trusting the other person to hear the freight of it. She said, "Good night, Junwoo." This time, the way she said his name was entirely different from the last time. They were careful about it. That was the thing she noticed. He did not push. He did not appear at her door the next morning expecting things to have resolved overnight. He did not mistake one honest conversation for a conclusion. He seemed to understand, with a precision she had not expected from him, that what she needed was not a grand gesture but a consistent reality. Not a man who told her he had changed, but a man who simply was different, in the small and repeated and entirely unglamorous ways that actually constituted change. He texted her the following Monday with a question about the Austin Acquisition Company, a legitimate question, a detail he had actually looked up because of the firm's work in adjacent sectors, and she answered it, and they had a brief, sharp exchange about market positioning that was 90% professional and 10% something else. And she found herself smiling at her phone in a conference room at 6:45 a.m., which was not something she had done in a long time. They had coffee the following Wednesday, in the building's lobby, which felt like a reasonable and unloaded geography. He bought it. She had already paid for her own before he arrived, because she was not yet ready to let him do things for her, and he seemed to understand that too, accepting her already paid coffee without comment or performance. She told Ingrid. Ingrid said, "How do you feel?" Celestine said, "Terrified." Ingrid said, "Good. That means it's real." The thing she had to decide, not once but repeatedly, as the weeks moved, was whether understanding the reason for something was the same as forgiving it. It was not a simple question. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life being professionally rigorous about cause and effect, about the difference between explanation and excuse, about the way people conflate the two because conflating them is more comfortable. Junwoo had an explanation, a real one. She believed it. She believed the fear had been genuine, believed the decision had come from a place of profound, misguided love, rather than cruelty or carelessness. She believed he had spent 4 years paying for it in the particular currency of a man who knows exactly what he cost himself. But she had also spent 4 years not knowing why. She had spent 4 years with a wound that had no explanation, which meant she had not been able to properly tend to it, had been forced to simply build around it. And the scar tissue of that was real, and it had shaped her in ways she was still mapping. The composure that people called strength. The absolute insistence on self-sufficiency that Ingrid sometimes called armor. The particular loneliness of a woman who had become so competent at managing her own life that she had quietly stopped expecting anyone else to participate in it. She did not blame all of that on him. She was not built for that kind of accounting. But she sat with the question of whether she was genuinely opening a door, or whether she was repeating the oldest mistake in the catalog, returning to someone because the familiar wound is more comprehensible than the unknown risk of something new. She was 32 years old and she understood herself. She was not going to outsource her discernment because the burgundy had been good and the candlelight had been atmospheric. She watched him, not obsessively, but carefully. The way she watched any investment, not for the projections but for the behavior when things were inconvenient. When the elevator was crowded and he did not get on and they had to wait together without the social script of a destination. When she was visibly exhausted after a difficult week and he brought her food without asking. Left it at her door with a text that said, "Eat something. Not because I'm managing you, but because I'm paying attention," and then did not wait for acknowledgement. He was paying attention. He had always been good at paying attention. The difference now was that he was not running from what he noticed. In the third week of June, she stood in his kitchen while he made tea. A completely ordinary thing. A Tuesday evening. Nothing ceremonially significant about it. And she watched his hands moving with the particular ease of a person who is at home in their own space. And she thought, I am not afraid of this anymore. Not unafraid of him hurting her again. That fear was rational and probably permanent at some low level. And she was not interested in pretending otherwise. But unafraid of the wanting. Unafraid of letting herself stand in his kitchen on a Tuesday and feel the full weight of what this was. He turned and found her looking at him with something he had not seen in 4 years. Not the composed distance, not the irony, not the armor. And he went very still. She said, I need you to understand something. He waited. She said, if you ever make a decision about my life without consulting me again, about what I can handle, about what's too much for me, about what you think I deserve or don't deserve, we're done. Not because I haven't heard you, because I will not spend another 4 years not knowing why. He said, yes. And he said it the way people say yes when they mean I understand this completely, and I am accepting it as a condition and not a suggestion. She said, okay then. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and kissed her in the way of a man who has not kissed someone in 4 years and thought he never would again. Not rushed, not desperate, but with the full and unhurried gravity of something that had been true for a very long time and was finally being allowed to exist in the light. She kissed him back, without armor, without performance. With every year of the 4 years she had spent becoming the woman she was, because she was kissing him as herself, and not as someone who had survived him, and that distinction was everything. Summer arrived in Los Angeles the way it always does, not all at once, but incrementally, the mornings getting warmer and the evenings lasting longer until one day you look up and realize the light has been golden for weeks, and you stopped noticing when that started. On the last Saturday of July, Celestine sat on Junwoo's couch with her legs folded beneath her, a tablet in her lap and a document open on the screen. The firm's quarterly review that she had promised herself she would finish before noon. Junwoo was across the room at the kitchen table with his own laptop and 3 tabs of something that was making him frown in the concentrated, unguarded way he had when he was genuinely working and not performing work. Korean pop was playing quietly from a speaker on the counter. Outside, the city was doing what the city did on a July Saturday, loud and warm and completely indifferent to any particular version of happiness. It was objectively an ordinary morning. Celestine thought, this is what I didn't know I was building toward. Not the apartment or the firm or the California light. Not any of the architecture of the life she had constructed. This, the specific, unremarkable, irreplaceable texture of being in a room with someone who knew all of it, and stayed. The way he refilled her coffee without being asked because he had memorized exactly how long it took her to go through a mug. The way he looked up from his work sometimes, and found her looking back, and the look that passed between them had no performance in it at all. She had not forgiven him all at once. That was not how it had worked. It had been a gradual and honest process, conducted in increments, tested in moments of inconvenience and vulnerability, and the small ordinary frictions that are the actual substance of a life shared. she had said, at some point, when she felt it was true and not before. I forgive you. She had said it quietly. Not as a ceremony, but as a fact, the way you report a measurement once you have taken it accurately. He had received it with the full weight of what it was. Had not minimized it, or performed relief at it. Had simply said, thank you. And had been, in the weeks since, the same person he had been in the weeks before. Consistent, present, unwilling to make unilateral decisions about her life no matter how much easier it sometimes would have been for him to do so. She had started noticing, sometime in July, that the armor she had been wearing since that Wednesday morning in March had come off in pieces. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a season changes. First a single layer, then another. Until she realized one morning that she was walking through the world as herself, entirely, without the performance of being impenetrable, and it was not frightening. It was, surprisingly and completely, a relief. Jun-woo looked up from his laptop. He watched her reading for a moment with the expression he got when he thought she wasn't looking, complete and open and not trying to be anything in particular. She looked up. He said, "You want to go up to the roof tonight?" Marcus said the sunset has been ridiculous lately. She said, Marcus tells everyone the sunset has been ridiculous. It's his thing. He said, it might actually be ridiculous this time. She said, fine. But I'm finishing this report first. He said, obviously. And he returned to his work. She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to. Thought about November 2020, and the silence and the 4 years and the diagnosis and the hallway and the candle and the kitchen and everything between. Thought about what it had cost them, both of them, and what had been preserved anyway, stubbornly, without either of them quite giving it permission. Thought about a Tuesday morning in March when she had stepped off an elevator and found the person she had spent 4 years erasing standing in a hallway, and how she had looked through him like he was architectural detail. Thought about how she was looking at him now. She said his name, just that, just Jun-woo, quietly, across the room. He looked up. She said, "The roof sounds good." He smiled. Not the careful, self-monitoring smile of a man navigating uncertain territory. The real one, the one she had once known by memory and had thought she would never see again. She went back to her report. Outside, Los Angeles went on being Los Angeles, golden and indifferent and enormous. And on the 14th floor of Vela Residences, in the quiet of 2 people who had earned their ordinary morning, something that had survived 4 years of silence finally learned how to breathe. Did she make the right choice? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Like this story. Subscribe for the next one. Share with someone who needs this today.